She had less than 10 minutes. 9 if the guards finished their shift early. 8 if someone decided to be diligent tonight. She ran barefoot down a marble corridor that had never known haste, her heels abandoned somewhere behind her like shed skin. The house was asleep, but not truly resting. Old mansions never slept, they listened. Cameras blinked red in recessed corners, antique clocks marked seconds too loudly, and the walls themselves seemed to remember every secret ever whispered into them. Vivian Harlow moved through that memory like a trespasser in her own life, her evening dress torn at the hem, silk catching on carved banisters and sharp edges of inherited wealth. Blood darkened her lower lip where she had bitten down to keep from making a sound. Panic tasted metallic, familiar, and she hated herself for recognizing it so well. The countdown was not abstract. It lived in her pulse, in the burn in her lungs, in the way her fingers trembled as she slid a stolen key card through a discreet reader hidden behind a 19th-century oil painting. The lock disengaged with a soft click that sounded obscene in the silence. Vivian froze, listening, her entire body rigid, ready to run or fight or vanish. Nothing followed. No footsteps. No raised voices. Only the low hum of the buildings, private generators, and the distant ocean pressing itself endlessly against the cliffs beyond the estate. Vivian Harlow was not supposed to be running. Officially, she was the polished public face of the Harlow Foundation, photographed at galas, quoted in lifestyle magazines, praised for her grace and composure. She was the daughter who smiled correctly, who wore grief like jewelry when her mother died, who learned early that survival in this family meant being useful. Unofficially, she was collateral, a solution, a debt payment dressed up as tradition. In 3 days, she was scheduled to marry Colton Brainard, a man whose reputation traveled faster than his lawsuits, a man spoken about in careful euphemisms at charity luncheons and behind locked doors. He did not collect art. He collected leverage. He collected people. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest as she slipped into a service stairwell, trading marble and chandeliers for concrete and fluorescent lights. This was not a dramatic escape fueled by fantasy. Vivian had planned this the way her father planned hostile takeovers. Every step had been mapped, every variable assessed. She had learned from the best, even if she despised the lesson. Her escape bag waited where it was supposed to, hidden behind a false panel in a linen closet no one had opened in years. Inside were neatly bundled stacks of cash, passports with names she had practiced signing in secret, jewelry stripped from family vaults piece by piece over months, and a small black flash drive wrapped in silk. That last item mattered more than the rest. It contained evidence, records, proof that the man she was meant to marry had built his empire on coercion and silence. It was her insurance, her last remaining weapon if everything else failed. Vivian slung the bag over her shoulder and kept moving. As she descended deeper into the house, the air changed. It smelled of dust and old pipes and the faint chemical bite of cleaning solutions. These corridors had been built for servants, for invisibility, for people who moved through the Harlow estate without ever being seen. As a child, Vivian had wandered them out of boredom and loneliness, memorizing their turns, learning where the cameras ended and the blind spots began. Her governess had scolded her for it. Her father had never noticed. Now those forgotten passages were saving her life. Time pressed harder. She imagined the guards at the East Wing laughing softly as they handed off radios, unaware that the most valuable asset in the house was already bleeding out of its grip. She imagined the morning headlines if she failed. The words runaway, unstable, ungrateful would be deployed with surgical precision. The narrative had already been prepared. All that remained was her compliance. She reached the final door and paused. This was the point of no return. Once she crossed the grounds, there would be no explanation that could be smoothed over, no apology that could put her back into her assigned place. The thought did not frighten her as much as she had once believed it would. What terrified her was the idea of staying. Vivian pushed outside. Cold night air hit her like a slap, stealing her breath. The estate grounds stretched wide and empty, manicured lawns glowing faintly under security lights, statues watching with stone indifference. She moved fast, keeping low, cutting across shadows where the lights failed to reach. Gravel bit into her feet, sharp and grounding. Pain was good. Pain meant she was awake. At the edge of the property, she vaulted a low fence and disappeared into the tree line, her dress snagging, tearing further. Branches clawed at her hair. Somewhere behind her, a sensor chirped once and fell silent again. Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure it would give her away. The town lay downhill, a cluster of muted lights pressed between forest and water. It was small, forgettable, the kind of place people passed through without leaving marks. That was why she had chosen it. At the far edge, just before the road bent toward the highway, a bar glowed warm and defiant against the darkness. The last place anyone would expect to find a Harlow heiress. The only place she believed she might still be safe. As she walked, the second pressure closed in. Memory. It was relentless. Images rose uninvited. Her father's hand resting too heavily on her shoulder during negotiations, the practiced smile she wore as men twice her age assessed her like an asset, the way her objections had been reframed as stress, as immaturity, as something that would be corrected once she was married. She remembered learning how to smile for cameras before she learned how to say no. She remembered swallowing fear, because it was easier than being dismissed. She was not just running from a wedding. She was running from erasure. The bar grew closer, its neon sign flickering, imperfect, human. For the first time in years, Vivian allowed herself a fragile thought. Maybe this worked. Maybe the person waiting for her inside was exactly who she believed him to be. Maybe the months of whispered promises and careful plans had not been another lie built on her need to believe. She reached the door and hesitated, one hand resting against the cool metal, breath coming hard and uneven. If she stepped inside and she was wrong, there would be no house to run back to, no role to retreat into. This was the gamble. Everything for the chance to choose herself. Vivian Harlow pushed the door open, unaware that the night was not finished with her yet, and that the moment she disappeared from her old life, something far darker and far more dangerous had already begun to move. The bar swallowed Vivian the moment she stepped inside, heat and noise closing around her like a second skin. The air was thick with the smell of alcohol, fried food, and old wood soaked in decades of spilled drinks and unspoken stories. Neon lights hummed overhead, bleeding red and blue into the dimness, reflecting off scratched mirrors and clouded glass. Laughter erupted too loudly from one corner, brittle and forced, while a jukebox murmured something slow and nostalgic that no one was truly listening to. It was the kind of place where people came to forget who they were for a few hours, and that alone made her pulse spike with unease. She did not stop near the entrance. She moved instinctively along the wall, letting shadows claim her, her body already adjusting to the environment the way it always had when survival mattered. Her eyes swept the room with ruthless efficiency. She cataloged exits, blind spots, the bartender's line of sight, the clusters of patrons whose attention was fully absorbed by their own lives. Trust, she knew now, was not given. It was measured, and tonight it was a liability. She found him exactly where she expected to, and that was the first fracture in her hope. Ethan Crowford sat in the far corner, half turned away from the room, his posture loose, careless, the tension she had imagined him carrying nowhere to be seen. He looked comfortable. Worse, he looked entertained. His jacket hung open, his shoulders relaxed, one arm draped casually across the back of the booth. He was not watching the door. He was not waiting with urgency or fear or anticipation. He was already settled, already at ease, as though the most dangerous part of the night had passed. Vivian felt something cold slide through her chest. Two men sat with him, one on either side, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They were not friends. She saw it immediately in the angles of their bodies, the way they leaned in just enough to create a closed triangle, the way their hands rested openly on the table, empty, confident. Their attention was fixed inward, on each other and on Ethan, not on the room. It was a configuration she recognized from boardrooms and backroom negotiations. This was not companionship. This was coordination. She did not approach. Instead, she slowed, becoming another anonymous figure lingering near the bar, her reflection fractured in a mirror behind rows of bottles. She kept her head down, letting her hair fall forward, using the chaos of the place as cover. Her heart beat harder with each step closer, but she forced herself to stay still, to listen, to absorb. Instinct told her to rush him, to demand answers, to collapse into the relief she had been promising herself for weeks. Experience told her that instinct was often a trap. What she heard dismantled her carefully constructed reality with surgical precision. Ethan was not tense because he was worried about her escape. He was animated because he was amused. His body language spoke of anticipation, not concern. The men beside him mirrored it, their energy sharp, predatory, focused on logistics rather than emotion. Vivian's mind struggled at first to reconcile what her eyes were seeing with what her heart had believed. She told herself she was misreading it, that fear was distorting her perception. Then she listened more closely, letting fragments of meaning assemble themselves in her consciousness. The plan revealed itself piece by piece, not as a sudden shock but as a slow, nauseating realization. This was not a rescue. It was a harvest. Ethan had not been waiting to save her. He had been waiting to collect her. Her desperation, her trust, her willingness to burn her old life to the ground had been factored in and monetized. They spoke of timing and roots, of how easily she would follow once she believed she was safe. They spoke of her money with open hunger, of the jewelry she had hidden so carefully, of how clean it would be to leave her somewhere remote, far enough from town that shock and fear would keep her frozen long after they were gone. They laughed. The sound cut deeper than any insult could have. It was not cruel laughter born of hatred. It was worse. It was casual, amused, as though what they were discussing was clever rather than monstrous, as though she were not a person but a story they would retell later, a clever con pulled off without effort. Vivian felt the room tilt. For a brief, terrifying moment, her mind tried to reject what she was hearing. Memory fought back, flooding her with images of whispered promises, of hands clasped in the dark, of careful words exchanged in private spaces where she had allowed herself to believe she was seen. She remembered the way Ethan had spoken about freedom, about leaving this town together, about building something new far from the gravity of her family's name. Those memories shattered now, splintering under the weight of reality, turning sharp and dangerous inside her. The betrayal was not loud. It was precise, efficient, the kind that did not require raised voices or threats because it assumed victory from the start. Her stomach churned, heat rising behind her eyes, but she did not cry, not yet. She pressed her fingers into the cool surface of the bar, grounding herself, forcing oxygen back into her lungs. Panic would get her caught. Panic would make her visible. She had not survived the Harlow household by giving panic control. She stayed long enough to be certain, long enough to know that there was no misunderstanding left to resolve, no explanation that could soften the truth. Ethan had already moved on from the version of her who trusted him. To him, she was a prize waiting to be claimed and discarded. When she turned away, she did so slowly, carefully, making sure her movement blended into the background. Her legs felt unsteady, as though the floor itself had betrayed her, but she forced them to obey. Each step toward the exit felt like walking away from a corpse that only she could see. Outside, the night air hit her again, colder now, sharper. The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed in her bones. The neon glow of the bar bled onto the wet pavement, casting warped reflections that looked like something melting. The world felt unchanged. Cars passed in the distance. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed. The normalcy of it all was almost unbearable. She moved forward without direction. The street stretched ahead of her, empty and dim, streetlights spaced too far apart, leaving pockets of darkness between them. Her chest tightened as the full weight of what had happened settled in. This had not been a single betrayal. It had been a confirmation of a pattern she had spent her life trying to deny. Power took what it could. Trust was currency. Love, when offered freely, was often treated as weakness. Her tears came then, hot and silent, streaking down her face as she walked. She wiped them away angrily, furious not just at Ethan, but at herself for believing that escape alone would save her. But the tears did not last. Something else replaced them, something colder, calculated, a familiar armor she had forged long before this night. She still had her bag, she still had her money, she still had evidence. They had not taken anything from her yet. That mattered. The realization steadied her. She straightened slightly, her stride lengthening, her mind shifting from shock to strategy. She would not return to the bar. She would not confront them. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. Whatever came next, she would choose it. Her foot caught on uneven pavement, her balance faltering as exhaustion and adrenaline collided. The world lurched sideways, and for a split second she felt the old, familiar sensation of falling, of losing control. A hand closed around her arm, firm and unyielding, stopping her before she hit the ground. The grip was steady, practiced, as though this was not the first time it had intervened at the edge of disaster. Vivian froze, her breath hitching, every instinct flaring at once. She did not pull away immediately. She did not scream. She assessed. The man who held her stood half in shadow beneath a flickering street lamp. He was taller than she expected, broader, his presence anchoring the space around them. His posture was calm, alert, his attention fully on her in a way that felt unnervingly complete. There was no hesitation in him, no surprise at finding her there in pieces. He looked as though he had stepped into the moment intentionally, as though chaos was something he navigated regularly. His name, she would soon learn, was Rowan Vale. In the yellowed light, she saw the details that mattered, the stillness in his shoulders, the way his stance blocked the street without making a show of it, the faint lines of old injuries etched into his hands. He did not loosen his grip, but he did not tighten it either. He simply held her there, suspended between collapse and whatever came next. Vivian felt a new awareness bloom in her chest, sharp and electric. The danger she had been running from all night had worn familiar faces. This one was different. This one was quiet, controlled. And as his hand remained on her arm, grounding her in place, she understood with sudden clarity that the night had not finished testing her yet. The night did not loosen its grip when Vivian stopped moving. It pressed closer, thick with salt air and the distant pulse of traffic, as if the world itself were holding its breath to see what she would do next. Rowan Vale's hand remained on her arm, steady and immovable, anchoring her in the narrow cone of light beneath the street lamp. The simple fact of that contact cut through the chaos inside her. Not comfort, not safety. Control. Hers, reclaimed in fragments. She forced her breathing to slow before she did anything else. Panic would have been easy. Pleading would have been easier still. She had been trained her entire life to soften her voice and make men feel generous. Tonight, she stripped that instinct down to the bone and discarded it. She spoke in compressed facts, each one selected for impact, each one carrying weight. A forced marriage engineered to settle a financial crisis. A lover who had never been a lover at all, only a scavenger waiting for her to break cover. A timeline measured in hours, not days. Men who would come looking once the absence was discovered. A family with enough influence to call any pursuit a welfare check and any capture an act of concern. She did not frame herself as a victim. She framed herself as a liability seeking mitigation. Rowan did not interrupt. He did not flinch at the mention of powerful names or the implication of violence. His attention never drifted. He listened the way strategists listened, filtering emotion out of information, mapping consequences behind his eyes. Vivian noticed everything while she spoke, because noticing had always been her first line of defense. The coat he wore was tailored but unbranded, the fabric dense and expensive in a way that did not advertise itself. His boots were worn at the edges, not from neglect but from use. Old scars cut faint white lines across his knuckles, the kind earned over time rather than in a single dramatic moment. He stood at an angle that gave him visibility in both directions down the street, not blocking her, not retreating, simply prepared. When she finished, silence stretched between them, heavy but not awkward. Rowan weighed the information with unsettling calm. When he finally responded, it was not with promises or reassurances, but with questions that revealed the shape of his mind. He asked about contracts, jurisdictions, timelines, leverage. He treated her situation as a problem that could be dismantled if one knew where to apply pressure. The absence of judgment was almost disorienting. Vivian did not soften in response. She had learned that stillness was not the same as safety. She reached into her bag and made the offer that had been forming since the moment she overheard the betrayal in the bar. Money, liquid assets, jewelry traceable to no one willing to admit ownership, passports, information, everything she had managed to extract from a life designed to consume her. In exchange, she wanted a shield, not protection born of goodwill, but something enforceable. A legal structure strong enough to shatter the marriage contract waiting for her and strip her family of the right to retrieve her by force. It was not romance. It was a transaction. Rowan did not reach for the bag. He did not look at it at all. Instead, he looked at her, really looked, as if measuring not her desperation but her resolve. When he answered, the shape of the night shifted. What he proposed was not a marriage in any sense Vivian recognized. It was not a ceremony or a contract filed in any courthouse. It was something older, darker, and infinitely more binding. A seal. A form of union recognized in circles that did not respect public law, enforced by systems that existed parallel to the world she knew. It was the kind of arrangement whispered about in conspiracy forums and dismissed by journalists as myth, yet quietly acknowledged by those who understood how power actually moved. Once established, it overrode family claims, invalidated existing agreements, and placed the bearer under protection that could not be challenged without consequence. Vivian did not believe in legends. She believed in results. Her mind raced, assessing. Anything this absolute carried a price. Anything this effective came with its own cage. She challenged the structure immediately, testing its edges, demanding clarity on autonomy, consent, and exit. She needed to know where the walls were before she stepped inside. The thought of trading one form of captivity for another made her skin crawl. Rowan did not push. He did not frame the seal as destiny or obligation. He outlined it as an option, nothing more. The choice, he made clear, would remain hers until the final moment. He offered something she had not been given since childhood. Time. Not much, but enough to decide without being cornered. The space he created unsettled her more than any threat could have. Vivian had spent her life reacting to pressure, to expectations that closed in until compliance felt inevitable. This was different. This was a cliff edge with no hands on her back. She turned away from him and walked a few steps, letting the cold bite through the thin fabric of her dress. The night stretched wide and indifferent. Somewhere beyond the trees and the dark road, her old life waited with open jaws. She could feel it pulling, the familiar gravity of obligation and fear. She could also feel something new, fragile but real, sparking beneath the exhaustion. The possibility of choosing not the lesser evil, but herself. She returned to Rowan with her decision, already crystallized. Agreeing did not feel triumphant. It felt precise. She agreed not because she trusted him, and not because she believed in the myth he represented, but because this path preserved her agency in a way no other option did. She agreed because living on her knees was no longer acceptable. The arrangement moved quickly after that, with an efficiency that suggested long practice. 2 witnesses were summoned, appearing without spectacle, their presence unremarkable and therefore deeply unsettling. They did not speak more than necessary. They observed. They recorded. The location shifted to a clearing beyond the town's edge, a forgotten strip of land where the forest thinned and the moonlight spilled cold and uninterrupted across the ground. There were no crowds, no symbols meant to impress. Only the night, the witnesses, and the understanding that what was about to occur could not be undone. The seal itself was not theatrical. There was no violence, no pain that Vivian could not withstand. What she felt instead was a sudden internal alignment, as if something fractured inside her had snapped into place. A quiet resonance settled in her chest, steady and grounding, like a signal locking onto a frequency it had been searching for without knowing it. The constant background noise of fear dulled, not erased, but managed. She remained fully herself, fully aware, yet no longer on the verge of collapse. Rowan's presence shifted as well, becoming less external and more constant, a weight she could sense even when she closed her eyes. It did not feel possessive. It felt stabilizing, a counterbalance rather than a restraint. The realization unsettled her, because it hinted at depth she did not yet understand. When it was done, there was no celebration. The witnesses acknowledged completion with minimal ceremony. Vivian adjusted her bag on her shoulder, grounding herself in the physical reality of what she still carried. The world had not ended. The night had not exploded into revelation. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing was. As they prepared to part ways, one of the witnesses addressed Rowan with a title that did not belong to a man meant to fade back into anonymity. The word was low, respectful, and carried the weight of command. Vivian caught it instantly, her attention sharpening despite the exhaustion pressing at the edges of her vision. Rowan did not correct it. There was no time to ask what it meant. The night was still dangerous, and her disappearance would not go unnoticed for long. But as she moved away, the echo of that title followed her, wrapping around the new, unfamiliar certainty in her chest. She had entered into a contract with the dark, and only now was she beginning to sense the true scale of what she had aligned herself with. Morning arrived too cleanly, as if the ocean wind had scrubbed the night from the world and left nothing behind but polished surfaces and consequences. The Harlow estate looked unchanged in daylight. White stone warmed by a pale winter sun, trimmed hedges cut into obedient geometry, tall windows reflecting the sky like mirrors designed to hide what happened inside. Birds moved through the trees without fear. The house continued its performance of stability, elegant and indifferent, while an entire future reshaped itself beneath its chandeliers. Vivian returned before the staff rotation changed, not because she had wanted to step back into that place, but because the place was the stage where the trap had been set. Leaving town would have been the simpler instinct, and it was exactly what her enemies would have expected. In the world she came from, panic looked like guilt, and disappearance looked like permission. She had learned that survival often required standing still in the center of danger and forcing everyone else to move around her. The first thing she noticed was the silence of the servants when she passed. It was not empty silence. It was controlled silence, the kind that spread when rumors traveled faster than facts. Eyes followed her from doorways. Heads dipped quickly. Hands paused mid-task. No one asked where she had been. No one offered concern. They had been trained by the household to observe without witnessing. Vivian had lived among them her whole life and still felt the distance, the invisible line that separated the useful from the owned. She went to her room and changed with speed that left no space for doubt. She chose a dress the way she chose weapons, not for beauty, but for function. Dark fabric, clean lines, high collar. No exposed skin to invite questions, no softness to suggest apology. She pinned her hair back so tightly it pulled at her scalp and forced her posture upright. The face looking back at her in the mirror seemed almost unfamiliar. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but her expression held a cold steadiness she had not known she possessed. She pressed her fingertips to the base of her throat, just beneath the edge of the collar, and felt the faintest warmth where the seal rested against her skin, more sensation than mark. It grounded her, not with comfort, but with certainty. Downstairs, the estate had transformed into a courtroom disguised as a reception. The great hall had been arranged for an audience that loved power but feared nomming it. Attorneys clustered near the fireplace, dark suits and sharpened smiles, their hands full of folders and non-disclosure agreements. Donors drifted in pairs, expensive perfumes layered over tension, eyes scanning for the best place to stand when the cameras arrived. Politicians arrived with practiced warmth, greeting the staff as if they remembered names, while their security teams moved quietly along the walls. Everyone wore an expression that suggested confidence. Everyone watched everyone else like predators watching for weakness. It was not a family gathering. It was a convergence of interests. Gregory Harlow stood near the center, half a step too far forward, as if he needed to occupy more space to keep control. Vivian saw immediately that something in him had shifted. He was not merely busy. He was unsettled. His movements were sharper than usual, his gestures clipped. He glanced at the doors too often. He spoke to the attorneys with impatience that bordered on panic. The man who built a reputation on calm dominance looked as though he had been backed into a corner and hated the feeling. A guest was expected, not an ordinary guest, someone important enough to make Gregory Harlow sweat through his composure. The reason was visible near the windows. Colton Brainard stood with a drink he had no need for, the glass held like a prop, his posture relaxed in a way that made the relaxation feel deliberate. He wore wealth the way men like him wore authority, not flashy, not loud, but unquestionable. His smile appeared when someone approached him, but it never reached his eyes. His gaze moved across the room as if he were evaluating inventory. When his attention landed on Vivian, it did not soften. It sharpened. To Colton, she was not a person returning from a sleepless night. She was a problem and a prize at once. She was the missing piece in a deal that would stabilize the Harlow name and expand his influence. The shape of his confidence suggested he believed the outcome was still inevitable. Men like him rarely considered that a woman might remove herself from the board entirely. Vivian moved into the hall with the calm of someone stepping onto a familiar set. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She greeted those who greeted her with the correct amount of politeness, neither warm nor cold, refusing to give anyone a crack to pry open. She felt eyes tracking her, measuring. The social machine assessed her the way it always did, searching for signs of weakness. She gave it none. Her father noticed her at last, relief flashing across his face for a fraction of a second before anger replaced it. Relief, because she was present and therefore controllable. Anger, because she had forced him to feel that relief at all. Vivian recognized the sequence like a pattern carved into stone. Gregory Harlow's love, when it surfaced, always arrived tangled with ownership. The hall continued its low, murmuring conversation, but the tension underneath had a new note, like a wire pulled too tight. Vivian caught another movement at the edge of her vision and felt something inside her go still. Ethan was there, dressed as part of the serving staff, blending into the background with practiced ease. He carried a tray, his posture humble, his face carefully blank. But his eyes were not blank. His eyes found her with quick precision, and in them she saw a familiar arrogance, as if last night had not ended with her escape but with his control. He looked at her, as though she were still in the story he had written for her. For a moment, Vivian's body tried to react the old way, with shame and heat and the instinct to shrink. She forced it down. She let the seal's steady presence anchor her. Ethan's confidence was an illusion based on outdated information. He thought she had walked out into the night and become nothing but a frightened girl again. He had not yet realized that the night had changed her into something far more dangerous. The public pressure built as more people arrived. The air filled with an expensive, suffocating blend of perfume and ambition. Phones vibrated quietly. Assistants whispered into earpieces. Conversations circled around land deals, development rights, philanthropic projects designed to disguise acquisitions. It was all the same machine Gregory had always fed, turning money into influence, influence into security, security into control. Vivian had once been made to believe this world was the only real one. Now it looked like a room full of people pretending not to drown. Gregory moved toward her, his jaw clenched, his eyes hard. He looked her over quickly, taking in the high collar, the composed posture, the lack of apology. His expression tightened further as if her calm itself was an offense. Vivian did not lower her gaze. The act felt small and monumental at once. Colton watched the exchange with mild interest, like a man observing a negotiation he was certain to win. His smile returned, faint and sharp. Then the moment came, not with drama but with something far worse. A simple accident. An older woman from the foundation's board stepped close, smiling with social familiarity, and reached up in a gesture that might have been maternal if it were not so possessive. She adjusted Vivian's collar as if correcting a flaw in an outfit, as if Vivian were an object to be perfected for public view. Vivian's body went rigid, instinct flaring, but the touch was brief, casual, performed in plain sight. Fabric shifted, the collar slid. For a single heartbeat, the seal at Vivian's throat became visible. It was not a bright mark or a bruise meant for melodrama. It was subtler, darker, a precise impression that did not belong to ordinary injury. Those who knew what to look for recognized it instantly. Those who did not still felt something in it that made their skin prickle, as if the mark carried a warning. The room fell into silence, so fast it felt like someone had cut power. Even the ocean seemed to hush. Eyes locked onto Vivian's throat. The older woman froze with her hand half withdrawn, her face draining of color. A donor's glass slipped slightly in his grip, the ice clinking too loud. A politician's smile collapsed into an expression of careful calculation. The attorneys stopped flipping through pages. Colton's posture changed, the ease in him tightening into alertness. Gregory Harlow saw it and exploded. His anger hit the hall like a wave. Vivian did not need to hear words to understand the meaning. His body language screamed betrayal, humiliation, loss of control. He stepped toward her as though he could erase the mark by force of will, as though he could undo a reality he did not authorize. His face flushed, and the mask of refined power he wore in public cracked enough for everyone to glimpse what lived underneath. A man who believed his daughter's body was territory he owned. Vivian stood perfectly still. She did not flinch. She did not cover the mark. She did not scramble to explain. The urge to apologize, drilled into her bones since childhood, rose like a reflex. She killed it before it reached her mouth. Apology would have been surrender. Explanation would have been negotiation. She had not come to negotiate her existence. The silence stretched, heavy and violent in its restraint. Colton's gaze fixed on the mark with the focus of a man reassessing risk. Something in his eyes darkened, not with fear, but with irritation. His claim, his contract, his assumption of ownership had been challenged in front of an audience. Men like him did not forgive public obstacles. Ethan, across the room, went very still. His tray remained steady in his hands, but his eyes sharpened with sudden unease. Whatever arrogance had been there before began to fracture. He had not expected this. He had planned for Vivian to come to him alone, frightened, carrying money. He had not planned for her to return marked by something he did not understand. Gregory's anger continued to rise, and the hall trembled on the edge of chaos. For a moment, it looked as though the entire carefully arranged morning would collapse into a scandal no public relations team could contain. Then the doors opened. The sound was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried through the silence like a blade sliding from a sheath. A figure stepped into the hall, and the temperature of the room seemed to change. It was not dramatic in a supernatural sense. It was social physics. Power entered, and everything else shifted to accommodate it. Rowan Vale moved with a controlled certainty that made space for him without effort. Guards at the doors, men trained to block threats, hesitated instinctively, their bodies responding to a hierarchy they had not consciously recognized. People turned toward him as if pulled by gravity. Conversations did not restart. Breaths did not loosen. The hush deepened. Vivian did not turn quickly. She let herself feel the room's reaction first, the ripple of recognition passing through those who understood what influence looked like when it did not need to announce itself. Then she faced him. He did not look like the stranger from the street lamp, not because his features had changed, but because context changed everything. In the harsh light of the hall, the precision of his appearance became clear. The tailored coat, the disciplined posture, the expression that held no need for approval. He wore authority like a quiet weapon. The men behind him were not bodyguards in the celebrity sense. They were disciplined, coordinated, their eyes scanning with professional detachment, their presence a statement without words. The elite in the room reacted in a way Vivian had never seen them react to her father. They did not greet Rowan with casual confidence. They recalibrated. They watched for cues. Some lowered their gazes slightly, not in submission but in instinctive caution. The politicians shifted their weight as if preparing to speak carefully. The attorneys stopped moving entirely, as if any sudden gesture might be interpreted as aggression. Gregory Harlow's fury faltered for the first time. It did not vanish. It fractured into something else: uncertainty, then fear, then the desperate need to regain footing. Vivian saw it clearly, and it was almost surreal. Her father had always been the apex predator in any room he entered. Now he looked like a man who had realized he was not at the top of the food chain after all. Rowan's gaze crossed the hall and landed on Vivian with a steadiness that cut through the chaos. The seal beneath her skin seemed to respond, a subtle internal pressure that made her spine straighten. It was not romantic. It was tethering. It reminded her, in the most physical way, that she was not standing alone. Rowan acknowledged the mark without display. Then he claimed the situation with the same calm he had shown under the street lamp, only now the calm carried the weight of consequence. The effect was immediate. The silence became absolute, not because everyone was shocked, but because everyone understood that the rules in this room had just been rewritten. Colton Brainard's face tightened. His smile disappeared entirely. For the first time, he looked not amused but wary. His eyes moved between Vivian's throat and Rowan's posture, calculating what kind of force he was dealing with. He had built his empire on contracts and intimidation. Rowan's presence suggested an authority that did not require either. Ethan's hand twitched around the tray. The smallest crack in his composure widened into visible panic. His plan had depended on Vivian being isolated. He had counted on her having no protector powerful enough to challenge the story he could tell afterward. Now the story was being taken from him in real time. The hall's attention locked onto Vivian again, but the quality of it had changed. They no longer saw her as Gregory Harlow's daughter, a decorative asset waiting to be transferred. They saw her as someone bound to a force outside the Harlow orbit. Their curiosity shifted into a sharper, more dangerous form: fear of the unknown hierarchy she now represented. Vivian felt the emotional price of it like a bruise forming under skin. She had wanted freedom. She had wanted to be unclaimed. Instead, she had walked into the only available escape route, and it came with its own label, its own shadow. She understood in a single, clear moment that she had purchased her autonomy from the most dangerous player on the map, a man whose power did not need to be explained aloud to be understood. The room's reaction proved it. She remained composed anyway. Her father's fury attempted one last surge, a final grasp for dominance, but it was already too late. In front of donors and lawyers and politicians, Gregory Harlow was no longer the one controlling the narrative. He was reacting. He was shrinking beneath a pressure he could not bully into submission. Vivian stood at the center of the room, the seal at her throat exposed, her face unreadable, and felt the gaze of every person there settle on her with new meaning. It was not admiration. It was not affection. It was recognition of a shift in ownership, a shift in allegiance. They looked at her the way people looked at a territory newly claimed by a stronger nation. And in that recognition, Vivian understood the chapter of her life that had just ended. The Harlows would never see her as simply free. They would see her as transferred, protected, dangerous. The morning had revealed the truth to everyone at once, and as the hall held its breath under Rowan Vale's quiet control, Vivian felt the sharp edge of her victory. She had escaped one cage, but she had done it by stepping into the shadow of something far larger, and now the entire room watched her as if she belonged to it. The private apartments were quiet in a way that felt deliberate, engineered to absorb shock rather than celebrate triumph. Thick walls muted the outside world, swallowing the echo of the great hall and the collective recalculation that had taken place there. Light filtered in through tall windows, softened by heavy curtains, turning the room into a space that felt insulated from time. It was a place designed for recovery, not confrontation. Vivian understood immediately that comfort had been anticipated for her, arranged as another form of control, and she rejected it on instinct. She did not collapse into relief. She did not let herself be carried by the momentum of rescue. The adrenaline that had carried her through the morning burned down slowly, leaving behind a sharper awareness of everything that had been exchanged in her name. Her body felt both powerful and exposed, as though she had survived a fall only to realize how close the ground truly was. The seal at her throat pulsed faintly beneath her skin, no longer foreign, but not yet familiar enough to trust. It was a reminder that freedom, when purchased in desperation, always came with fine print. Vivian stood near the window, her reflection layered over the landscape beyond the glass. She looked like a woman who had won something important. Inside, she felt like a woman who had traded one kind of vulnerability for another. The contradiction sat heavy in her chest. She had offered money to a man who did not need it, and the imbalance of that exchange unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. In her world, money was leverage. Here, it had been irrelevant. That realization stripped her of a defense she had relied on her entire life. She did not want to be an ornament attached to power. She had been that before, polished and displayed to increase her family's value. She refused to repeat the pattern under a different banner. What she needed now was not protection wrapped in possessiveness, but clarity, rules, structure, a way to exist beside danger without being consumed by it. Rowan gave her space, both physically and psychologically, a choice that spoke louder than any reassurance could have. When he finally addressed what had happened, it was without theatrics. He did not frame his actions as heroic or inevitable. He laid them out as decisions made with intent, stripped of romance and sentimentality. He acknowledged the imbalance between them without attempting to soften it. He revealed that his silence about his true position had been deliberate, not as manipulation, but as refusal to contaminate her choice with his influence. He had watched her the night before not as an asset or a prize, but as a person cornered by a system that fed on compliance. He had seen in her the rare act of self-preservation that did not ask for permission. He had wanted her decision to come from that place, untainted by fear of his reach or attraction to his authority. If she had known who he was, her offer would have been compromised by calculation. He had accepted the risk of her anger to preserve the integrity of her consent. Vivian absorbed this with the caution of someone who had learned that explanations often concealed traps. Trust, for her, had become a tool edged with barbs, capable of tearing as much as it bound. She did not soften in response to his honesty. She examined it, tested it, measured it against the reality of her own experience. Intent did not erase impact. Understanding did not dissolve the humiliation she felt at having been so exposed. She turned from the window and faced him fully, her posture straight, her expression unyielding. Whatever existed between them would not be built on gratitude or awe. It would be negotiated. The dynamic shifted in that moment. What followed was not a confrontation, but an alignment of boundaries. Vivian articulated her needs with precision, the way she had learned to present terms in boardrooms where her presence had once been decorative. She required autonomy not as a courtesy, but as a condition. Access to information that affected her life. The ability to veto decisions concerning her body, her movements, her future. No public displays of ownership disguised as protection. No decisions made on her behalf, without her knowledge. Rowan accepted these terms without resistance. He did not argue semantics or attempt to redefine control as care. He recognized that any protection enforced without consent would mirror the structures she had escaped. His authority, immense and unspoken, did not diminish by accommodating her demands. If anything, it was clarified by the restraint he exercised. They did not define what they were to each other in emotional terms. Labels were unnecessary and premature. What they constructed instead was a framework, a quiet accord that acknowledged the danger of proximity while insisting on respect. It was not tenderness. It was something more brittle and honest, forged from mutual recognition of power and risk. Outside the insulated calm of the apartments, the world did not pause. Ethan understood his mistake with the clarity of a man watching a door close behind him. The plan he had built on secrecy and speed had collapsed into exposure. He moved quickly, too quickly, attempting to erase traces of his involvement before the narrative solidified against him. Messages were deleted, accounts emptied, contacts severed. But panic had a way of leaving fingerprints, and his efforts only sharpened attention where there had once been none. Colton Brainard reacted differently. He did not scramble. He escalated. His influence flowed through legal channels designed to give predation the appearance of legitimacy. Petitions were drafted. Concerns were raised about Vivian's mental state, framed as compassionate alarm rather than retaliation. The groundwork for declaring her incapable of consent was laid with calculated patience. To Colton, the problem was not that she had escaped. The problem was that she had done so publicly. Gregory Harlow watched these developments with a man's instinct for survival finally overriding his hunger for control. Fear tempered his rage, but it did not erase his ambition. He weighed alliances the way he always had, shifting loyalties where necessary, testing the strength of the new force that had claimed his daughter. His greed did not vanish. It recalibrated. Vivian sensed these movements even without direct access to their details. She felt them as pressure in the air, as tension that refused to dissipate. The seal at her throat responded subtly, not with alarm but with awareness, as if acknowledging threats before they fully materialized. It reminded her that what she had entered was not a sanctuary. It was a battleground with different rules. Rowan prepared for confrontation with the same calm efficiency he had shown from the beginning. He assembled information, secured witnesses, mapped the paths through which power would attempt to reassert itself. He did not act unilaterally. He brought the strategy to Vivian and waited. The decision was placed where it belonged. Vivian considered what pursuing a public reckoning would mean. It would not be clean. It would not be quiet. It would expose wounds she had spent years concealing, invite scrutiny that would follow her long after the immediate threat had been neutralized. It would force her to stand in the open and let others decide what parts of her story mattered. There was no guarantee of satisfaction, only closure. She understood then that vengeance was not what she wanted. Vengeance kept her tied to those who had hurt her, defined her future by their actions. What she sought was an ending. A definitive line drawn beneath a chapter that had poisoned every choice she made afterward. She wanted the narrative to conclude on her terms, not to be rewritten by men who believed her existence was negotiable. When she agreed to move forward, it was not with fire in her veins, but with a cold, steady resolve. The choice did not feel righteous. It felt necessary. The night she had fled had stripped her down to instinct. The morning had revealed the cost of survival. Now, in the quiet between storms, Vivian claimed something more dangerous than escape or protection. She claimed authorship. The preparations moved ahead, methodical and controlled, while she stood at the center of it all, no longer reacting, no longer running. The confession she had demanded was not an act of tenderness. It was an exchange of truth sharpened into structure. And as the pieces aligned around her, Vivian understood that whatever came next would unfold not because she had been rescued, but because she had chosen to stand and be counted. The great hall filled slowly, deliberately, in a way that transformed it from a symbol of inherited privilege into something far more volatile. The chandeliers still glowed, the marble still shone, but the composition of the crowd altered the meaning of the space. This was no longer a room curated exclusively for wealth and influence. The doors remained open, and people who had never been invited past them before stepped inside with cautious curiosity. Staff members stood beside donors. Security guards shared space with locals from the nearby town. Faces accustomed to being ignored looked up at faces accustomed to being obeyed, and for once, no one could pretend not to see the imbalance. The atmosphere carried the low hum of anticipation rather than spectacle. This was not a show staged for applause. It was a reckoning engineered to be witnessed. Vivian entered the hall beside Rowan, not a step behind him and not ahead of him, but aligned. The distinction mattered. She was not displayed as proof of his authority, nor hidden as something fragile. Her presence was intentional and unembellished. The seal at her throat was visible now, no longer concealed, not as provocation but as fact. She did not brace herself for judgment. She had passed that threshold already. Eyes followed her movement through the room, but the quality of attention had shifted again. There was no speculative hunger in it, no attempt to assess her value. Instead, there was something quieter and more unsettling: acknowledgement. People sensed that the narrative they were about to witness would set precedent, not because it was merciful, but because it was precise. Ethan was brought in without ceremony. He did not look dramatic or defiant. He looked diminished. The confidence that had once animated him had collapsed under the weight of inevitability. He wore the expression of someone who had exhausted every escape route and finally understood that speed and charm could not outrun structure. His gaze flicked across the room, searching for recognition, for sympathy, for some familiar foothold. He found none. The case against him unfolded with mechanical clarity. There was no raised voice, no theatrical accusation designed to inflame emotion. Evidence replaced outrage. Audio recordings captured in the bar, stripped of context and excuses. Witness statements from staff who had overheard plans he believed invisible. Timelines mapped with unforgiving precision, showing how he had coordinated movements, anticipated Vivian's vulnerability, calculated her fear as leverage. Financial trails illuminated the intention behind his actions, revealing preparation rather than impulse. The hall absorbed each detail in silence. Vivian watched without flinching. The man she had once trusted no longer occupied any emotional space inside her. The memory of him had been reduced to data points and consequences. There was no satisfaction in seeing him exposed, only a steady sense of reclamation. Her trust had been taken from her without consent, and now it was returned to her in a different form, proof that it could no longer be weaponized. Rowan remained still beside her, not intervening, not guiding the narrative toward cruelty or absolution. The structure of the proceeding did not require his aggression. His power lay in restraint, in allowing the facts to suffocate denial on their own. The people in the room understood this instinctively. Violence would have been simpler. This was far more effective. When the outcome was delivered, it was not framed as punishment for betrayal alone. It was framed as consequence for intent. Ethan was stripped of access, not only to money and opportunity, but to credibility. His name, once unremarkable, became a liability. Networks that had tolerated him in silence now closed ranks against him. Attempts to disappear were rendered meaningless when every avenue led back to a mark he could not erase. The message was unmistakable. Predation would no longer be absorbed as collateral damage. The effect rippled outward immediately. Colton Brainard's legal offensive collapsed under scrutiny that refused to bend. Contracts drafted in arrogance were invalidated with surgical efficiency. The narrative of concern he attempted to construct around Vivian's autonomy disintegrated when confronted with evidence of coercion and bad faith. His influence, formidable as it was, recoiled from open confrontation. The cost of escalation became too high, the war unwinnable without exposure he could not afford. He withdrew, not in defeat, but in calculation, leaving behind the hollow outline of a power that had finally met resistance it could not consume. Only then did Vivian turn to the second door that needed closing. Gregory Harlow met her in a private room adjacent to the hall, stripped of the audience that had once reinforced his authority. Without witnesses, he looked older, smaller, his certainty eroded by the realization that he was no longer the axis around which events revolved. Vivian did not approach him as a daughter seeking reconciliation. She approached him as a woman concluding a transaction that should never have existed. The document placed before him was not complex. Its simplicity was its cruelty. It severed the family's right to intervene in her life under any pretense. It revoked the assumption of stewardship he had exercised since her childhood. It outlined consequences for violation that extended beyond social discomfort into tangible loss. There was no emotional appeal embedded in its language, only boundaries. Gregory read it slowly, his face tightening with each line. In his expression, Vivian saw the accumulation of years in which he had mistaken proximity for entitlement and preparation for possession. The moment of realization was not dramatic. It was quiet and devastating. He understood, at last, that he had lost her long before this night, not because she had rebelled, but because he had never truly seen her. When he signed, his hand shook. The gesture did not redeem him. It did not undo the damage he had inflicted. It simply acknowledged reality. Vivian accepted the signed document without triumph. Closure did not feel like victory. It felt like space opening where pressure had lived for too long. She did not linger. There was nothing left to extract from that relationship. Whatever humanity remained between them would have to exist outside of control, or not at all. The house exhaled as she left it. Departure came without fanfare. No press, no public statements. The narrative had already been set in motion and no longer required her presence. Vivian stepped into the waiting vehicle with a composure that surprised even her. The exhaustion that followed was not collapse but release, the kind that settled into the body once vigilance was no longer required every second. As the car moved away from the estate, dawn crept across the landscape, pale and uncertain. Fog gathered low over the road, blurring the edges of the world ahead. Vivian watched it through the window, her reflection faint against the shifting light. She did not feel fear rising to meet the unknown. For the first time, her instincts were quiet. Rowan sat beside her, present without intrusion. Whatever existed between them was not wrapped in promises of happiness or illusions of safety. It was grounded in awareness. Security would be expensive. Trust would be negotiated daily. Power would require accountability. Nothing about the future was guaranteed, and that was precisely why it felt real. Vivian did not look back. She was no longer fleeing a cage or stepping into one disguised as salvation. She was moving toward a life that demanded intention, toward a version of herself that would have to be built rather than inherited. The man beside her was dangerous, not because he dominated, but because he understood restraint. He had learned to ask rather than take, and that made him unlike any force she had known. As the fog thickened and the road curved forward, Vivian felt the weight of the past finally settle into something finite. The verdict had been delivered. The story that had defined her had reached its end. What came next would not be gentle, but it would be chosen, and for the first time in her life, that was enough. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.